August 19, 1941, high above the English Channel. Hauptmann Heinrich Faber sat in the armored pilot seat of his Heinkel 111 bomber and looked out at the morning sky. Weber was a veteran of Kampfgeschwader 53. He had flown over Poland. He had flown over France. He had survived the intense skies of 1940. He knew everything there was to know about the enemy. He knew the mathematics of survival. He knew the exact thickness of the steel armor plating directly behind his seat. He knew exactly how many seconds of enemy fire his bomber could absorb before structural failure became inevitable. The intelligence officers back at the Luftwaffe testing ground in Rechlin had done their jobs perfectly. They had captured enemy fighters. They had dismantled them. They had published thick manuals detailing every weakness of the British defensive network. The German bomber crews had memorized these manuals. They knew the Supermarine Spitfire was extremely dangerous. It was fast, sleek, and aerodynamically perfect. When a Spitfire appeared, the Luftwaffe crews tightened their grips and prepared for a lethal duel. But the other fighter, the Hawker Hurricane, generated a very different reaction. When the blunt, thick-winged profile of a Hurricane appeared on the horizon, the tension in the German bomber formations would noticeably drop. The Hurricane was a machine out of time. It was a biplane design masquerading as a monoplane. It had a fabric-covered fuselage stretched over a primitive tubular frame. It was slow, heavy, and obsolete. Weber had personally witnessed the limitations of the Hurricane during the previous summer. He had watched them struggle to gain altitude. He had watched them fall behind the faster German escorts. He had watched their bullets bounce off his bomber. The standard Hurricane Mark I carried 8 machine guns. To a civilian, 8 machine guns sounded devastating. To a professional Luftwaffe pilot, 8 machine guns were a known mathematical variable, and the equation strongly favored the bomber. The British fired a small .303 caliber bullet. It was a rifle round. Against unarmored targets, it was highly effective. Against the thick armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks of a heavy Heinkel, it was merely an annoyance. The Rechlin engineers had tested the Allied ammunition against German armor. They had measured the kinetic energy. They had proven that unless a Hurricane pilot held his fire on the exact same spot for an extended burst, the bomber would survive. But holding an extended burst in aerial combat was physically impossible. The target was moving at 250 miles per hour. The attacker was moving at 300 miles per hour. The firing window was measured in fractions of a second. In a typical high-speed pass, an 8-gun Hurricane could put perhaps 20 or 30 rounds into a bomber. Scattered across the massive airframe of a Heinkel, those small holes did nothing structural. The bomber would simply fly home. This was the foundation of German confidence. They believed they had solved the problem of the Hurricane. They had measured its speed, calculated its firepower, and dismissed it as a relic of a dying empire. The German High Command assumed the British would retire the Hurricane. They assumed it would be relegated to training duties. No modern air force would continue to deploy a fabric-covered fighter against the finest bombers in the world, but totalitarian systems often misunderstand the nature of democratic industrialism. The German mindset was focused on engineering perfection. If a machine was flawed, it was replaced by a better machine. The arsenal of democracy operated entirely differently. Where the Luftwaffe saw an aerodynamic failure, the industrial engineers of the free world saw a canvas. The Hurricane was slow. It was heavy. It had an unnecessarily thick wing, but that thick wing contained something incredibly valuable. It contained empty space. While the brilliant elliptical wing of the Spitfire was so thin that it could barely hold its own ammunition, the agricultural wing of the Hurricane was basically a flying warehouse. It was hollow, reinforced by sturdy metal tubes. The engineers looked at the thick wing. They looked at the inability of the 8-gun arrangement to bring down German bombers. And they made a decision that offended every principle of German aeronautical science. They did not design a new airplane. They did not spend years developing a lighter airframe. Instead, they decided to fill the empty space in the Hurricane wing with American-designed machine guns. The weapon they chose was the Browning .303 caliber machine gun. It was a localized version of the famous American Colt Browning design. It was not a weapon of precision. It was a weapon of mass production. The American industrial machine had standardized the Browning. Factories across the United States and the Allied nations were producing these weapons by the tens of thousands. They were simple, rugged, and entirely reliable. Most importantly, the Browning fired at an astonishing rate. One gun could fire 1,100 rounds per minute. It was a mechanical buzzsaw, powered by democratic abundance. The engineers took the standard Hurricane wing, which already carried 4 guns on each side. They cut into the metal. They widened the ammunition bays, and they added 2 more Browning machine guns to each wing. The result was the Hawker Hurricane Mark IIB. It carried 12 machine guns, 6 in the left wing, 6 in the right wing. It was an unprecedented concentration of firepower in a single-engined fighter. The German engineers would have been horrified by the aerodynamics. The muzzles of the extra guns protruded awkwardly from the leading edge of the wing. The weight of the extra weapons and ammunition made the already sluggish fighter even slower. It handled like a flying brick. It took much longer to climb. Its turn radius suffered. By every metric of traditional fighter combat, the Mark IIB was a worse airplane than the version that preceded it. But the designers did not care about traditional fighter combat. They were not trying to outturn the Messerschmitt 109. They were building a flying execution block for German bombers. The mathematics of the 12-gun Hurricane were absolutely staggering. With 12 American-designed Brownings firing simultaneously, the aircraft unleashed 13,200 rounds per minute. That meant 220 bullets left the aircraft every single second. It was not a stream of fire. It was a physical wall of lead, copper, and cordite smoke moving through the air at supersonic speeds. To feed this mechanical monster, the aircraft had to carry a massive amount of ammunition. The inner guns carried 340 rounds each. The outer guns carried 330 rounds each. A fully loaded Hurricane Mark IIB carried roughly 4,000 rounds of ammunition into the sky. The weight of the brass and lead alone severely altered the center of gravity. Producing this much ammunition required a logistical miracle. A single squadron of 12-gun Hurricanes could expend nearly 50,000 rounds in a single brief engagement. This was a consumption rate that no pre-war doctrine had anticipated, but this is where the American industrial engine made its presence felt. Across the Atlantic Ocean, massive ammunition plants were running 24 hours a day to supply the Allied war effort. Women in factories from Connecticut to California were stamping brass casings, filling them with powder, and pressing the lead projectiles into place. They were producing ammunition in volumes that broke the scale of human comprehension. Box after wooden box of .303 caliber ammunition was loaded onto Liberty ships. They crossed the Atlantic Ocean through the submarine blockades. They arrived at English ports and were trucked to airfield by the millions. The German intelligence officers knew nothing of this. Their reports from August 1941 still listed the Hurricane as an 8-gun fighter. Their armor thickness calculations remained entirely unchanged. If your family has a story connected to the logistical chains that kept these squadrons armed, those accounts belong in the historical record. Share them below. Back in the sky over the channel, Hauptmann Weber adjusted his oxygen mask. His formation of Heinkel 1011s was flying at 14,000 feet. The weather was clear. The target was a rail yard in southern England. His radio crackled. The tail gunner reported incoming aircraft. Enemy fighters were climbing from the coast. The German escorts above them peeled away to engage, leaving the bombers to maintain their rigid defensive formation. Weber looked through the thick armored glass of his cockpit. He squinted against the glare of the morning sun. He saw the silhouettes of the interceptors growing larger against the clouds. He recognized the thick wings immediately. He recognized the distinct hunchbacked profile of the fuselage. It was not the sleek, terrifying shape of the Spitfire. It was the familiar, sluggish form of the Hawker Hurricane. Weber felt his heart rate steady. He signaled to his co-pilot. They were facing the old agricultural machines, the obsolete fabric-covered biplanes in disguise. The German gunners in the bomber formation checked their weapons. They knew how to handle Hurricanes. They knew they just had to maintain formation, keep up their defensive fire, and let the thick armor plate do its job. The incoming Hurricanes leveled off behind the bomber formation. They were not maneuvering wildly. They were simply lining up directly behind the Heinkels, making themselves perfect targets for the German tailgunners. It was exactly what the Luftwaffe training manuals predicted. The Hurricane was too slow to attempt slashing attacks from the side. It had to attack from dead astern, sitting in the slipstream. Weber watched the lead Hurricane settle into position behind his wingman's bomber, perhaps 300 yards away. The distance was closing. The German tail gunner opened fire, his tracer rounds reaching out toward the British fighter. The Hurricane did not evade. It sat inside the stream of defensive fire, its heavy Merlin engine absorbing the punishment. The pilot was waiting for his exact range. The Allied engineers had learned from the previous year. They no longer set their guns to converge at 400 yards. They had adjusted the alignment of all 12 weapons to meet at a single point exactly 250 yards ahead of the spinner. This convergence zone created a focal point of absolute destruction. For a space roughly the size of a kitchen table, the bullet streams from all 12 machine guns violently intersected. Anything caught inside that 250-yard focal point would not be hit by a scattering of bullets. It would be struck by the concentrated energy of a small factory throwing lead into a single point. The Hurricane pilot closed the distance. 280 yards. 260 yards. The thick wing of the fighter seemed to swell in the German tail gunner's sight. 250 yards. The pilot pressed the brass firing button on his control column. Pneumatic valves opened. Compressed air slammed the firing pins of 12 American-designed Browning machine guns forward simultaneously. In the cockpit of the Heinkel, Weber heard a sound he had never heard before. It was not the familiar rattling of machine gun fire. It was a solid, continuous roar. It sounded like heavy canvas being ripped directly next to his ear. It was the acoustic signature of 220 bullets per second, breaking the sound barrier as they crossed the gap between the aircraft. The impact on the wingman's bomber was not a series of punctures. It was a structural deletion. The convergence point of the 12 guns walked directly across the right engine of the Heinkel 101. The armor plating did not matter. The volume of fire was so intense that the kinetic energy simply shattered the metal. The bullets hit the engine block with such frequency that the engine mount simply disintegrated. Weber watched in absolute shock as the entire right engine of his wingman's bomber tore itself free from the wing. It did not catch fire. It was simply sawed off the airframe by the sheer weight of lead. The 12-gun Hurricane adjusted its nose slightly. The stream of fire moved from the empty engine nacelle across the wing root and directly into the fuselage of the bomber. The German intelligence officers had calculated that Heinkel could survive 30 hits from a .30 3 caliber weapon. They were correct. But the bomber was not taking 30 hits. It was taking 300 hits in under 2 seconds. The structural integrity of the fuselage vanished. The aluminum skin shredded into thousands of spinning fragments. The internal ribs snapped under the concentrated impact of the American-made bullets. The bomber folded in half. The tail section snapped upward, severed completely from the main fuselage. The massive aircraft tumbled out of the formation, spilling debris and aviation fuel into the cold morning air. The entire engagement had lasted 3.5 seconds. The Hurricane had fired nearly 800 rounds of ammunition. It broke away, sluggish and heavy, searching for its next target. Inside his own cockpit, Weber gripped his control yoke with white-knuckled hands. His mind desperately tried to process what he had just witnessed. His entire understanding of aerial warfare had just been violently dismantled. The machine that had destroyed his wingman looked like a hurricane. It flew like a hurricane. But it had struck with the force of an airborne artillery battery. The defensive doctrine of the Luftwaffe relied entirely on the mathematical limits of the 8-gun fighter. When the enemy arbitrarily changed the mathematics of production and volume, the entire doctrine collapsed. Another Hurricane pulled in behind Weber's bomber. He could see the leading edge of the thick wings flashing with continuous fire. It was not 8 small points of light. The entire front of the wing seemed to be ablaze. This was the moment the hubris of the German command met the reality of the arsenal of democracy. They had dismissed the agricultural fighter, never imagining that democratic industry could supply enough guns and ammunition to make it lethal. The wall of lead reached Weber's Heinkel. The armor plating behind his seat rang with a deafening series of impacts. It felt as though a giant hammer was repeatedly striking the back of his chair. The armor held against the first fraction of a second. But the volume of fire was inescapable. The bullets found the gaps. They found the unarmored control cables. They found the hydraulic lines. They found the structural spars. Weber felt the control column go completely slack in his hands. The cables connecting his yoke to the elevators had simply ceased to exist, shredded by the density of the incoming fire. His aircraft pitched downward, completely out of control. The invincible bomber formation was scattering, desperate to escape the lumbering, heavily armed bricks that were tearing them out of the sky. Weber fought the dying bomber all the way down to the surface of the channel. Through desperate manipulation of the engine throttles, he managed to level the shattered Heinkel just before impact. The aircraft slammed into the water, tearing the fuselage open. Weber and his surviving crew scrambled into their inflatable raft, watching the remains of their once invincible bomber sink beneath the freezing waves. Hours later, a German rescue boat pulled them from the water. They were wrapped in blankets and transported back to their airbase in occupied France. The debriefing room was silent. The intelligence officers from Rechlin were waiting. They had their notepads. They had their charts. They asked Weber how his formation had been broken by an obsolete fighter that they had already mathematically dismissed. Weber's post-war testimony, preserved in historical records, described this specific debriefing. The officers asked him if he had been ambushed by a new type of heavy twin-engine fighter. He shook his head. He told them it was the Hurricane. The officers corrected him. They explained that a Hurricane could not inflict structural amputation on a Heinkel 111. The math did not support his claim. Weber stared at the engineers. He told them he did not care about their mathematics. He had seen a wall of lead sever an aircraft wing in 3 seconds. He demanded they re-evaluate the enemy. It took weeks for the Luftwaffe intelligence apparatus to piece together the truth. From intercepted radio chatter, from spies, and finally from a crashed Mark IIB recovered from the French countryside. When the German engineers dismantled the crashed aircraft, their reaction was a mixture of professional disgust and profound strategic dread. They found the 12 American-designed Browning machine guns crammed into the wings. They found the crude metal modifications. They found the massive, heavy ammunition boxes holding thousands of rounds. To the German engineering mind, it was an absolute abomination. It was brute force replacing elegance. It was the sacrifice of aerodynamic purity for the simple, vulgar ability to throw more lead into the air. The German technical experts wrote their report. They noted that the aircraft was incredibly slow. They noted that its performance had been severely compromised by the added weight. They noted that it was an evolutionary dead end. But the bureaucratic realists in the Luftwaffe command read the same report and felt cold terror. They understood the logistical implications of what the industrial base of the free world had done. To field a squadron of 12-gun fighters, an air force needed an unfathomable supply of weapons. A single squadron required 144 machine guns just to equip the aircraft. They required hundreds more in reserve. Germany struggled to produce enough high-quality weapons to equip their elite fighter wings. They machined everything to exact tolerances. Their weapons were expensive masterpieces of engineering. The Allies had bypassed engineering perfection entirely. They had used their massive industrial base to produce a simple machine gun by the hundreds of thousands, and they were bolting them into obsolete airplanes in bundles of 12. The German command realized that they were not just fighting a rival air force. They were fighting the sheer volume of democratic manufacturing. They were fighting factories in Detroit and steel mills in Pennsylvania. The Hurricane Mark IIB began appearing in every theater of the war. Its arrival on the Eastern Front shocked the Soviet pilots who received them, but they quickly learned to appreciate the flying shotgun. Over the deserts of North Africa, the 12-gun Hurricanes devastated Axis transport columns. The density of fire was so great that a single strafing pass could shred a convoy of supply trucks into burning scrap. The volume of fire compensated for the inaccuracy of high-speed flight. A pilot did not need to be a marksman. He only needed to point the nose of the aircraft in the general direction of the enemy and press the button. German infantrymen in the desert learned to recognize the sound of the Merlin engine. They learned that the thick-winged fighter did not drop a few bombs and leave. It brought a storm of lead that swept the ground completely clean. The psychological impact on the German forces was documented in countless field reports. The realization that the enemy possessed an inexhaustible supply of ammunition deeply eroded their morale. A German anti-aircraft gunner captured in North Africa would later write in his memoir that his battery was rationed to 50 rounds per day. They watched a single Hurricane expend 4,000 rounds in 30 seconds against a sand dune. The contrast between totalitarian scarcity and democratic abundance was visible in the sky every single day. The Axis forces had the better engineers. The arsenal of democracy had the deeper factories. The evolution of the Hurricane did not stop with 12 machine guns. Once the industrial planners realized the thick wing could carry immense weight, they pushed the concept even further. They removed the machine guns and installed 4 20mm cannons. Then they removed the cannons and installed 2 massive 40mm anti-tank guns. The aircraft became slower, heavier, and more aerodynamically compromised with every single modification. It defied every principle of fighter design, and it destroyed German armor with terrifying regularity. The Luftwaffe attempted to adapt. They ordered their bomber formations to fly higher where the heavy, struggling Hurricanes could not reach them. They ordered their fighters to target the Hurricanes first, but the numbers were entirely against them. By 1942, the production facilities in Britain and Canada were churning out Hurricanes at a staggering, relentless rate. Canadian Car and Foundry, operating deep within the safety of North America, built 1,451 Hurricanes. They were immune to German bombing. They worked in brightly lit factories. They shipped the aircraft across the ocean in crates, alongside millions of rounds of American-made ammunition and tens of thousands of Browning machine guns. The German High Command reviewed the production estimates. The numbers were incomprehensible. The Axis factories were being bombed around the clock. The Allied factories were expanding. A Luftwaffe staff officer in Berlin analyzed the kill claims. He noted that even when German fighters shot down 3 Hurricanes for every one they lost, the mathematical outcome was inevitable. The Allies could build a Hurricane faster than the Luftwaffe could train a pilot to shoot it down. The aircraft was built of metal tubes and fabric. It could be repaired in a field with basic tools. If a Spitfire wing was damaged, it required specialized metallurgical repair. If a Hurricane wing was damaged, a mechanic could patch the fabric and replace the damaged tubing in a matter of hours. This simplicity meant that the operational readiness rate of Hurricane squadrons remained incredibly high, even in the harshest environments. They fought in the freezing mud of Russia and the abrasive sand of Egypt. Weber, the Heinkel pilot who had survived the first encounter, was reassigned to a training command. He spent the rest of the war teaching young German conscripts how to fly. He told them about the Spitfire. He told them about the American Mustangs that would eventually fill the skies. But he also warned them specifically about the thick-winged relic. He taught them the most important lesson of industrial warfare. He told them that a perfectly engineered weapon is absolutely meaningless if the enemy can overwhelm it with a dozen simple ones. He warned them that when a Hurricane approached, they were not fighting an airplane. They were fighting the combined industrial output of an entire continent. The statistics of the Hawker Hurricane's wartime service are a testament to the power of volume. 14,533 aircraft were built. They accounted for more than 60% of the German aircraft destroyed during the Battle of Britain. They sank ships. They destroyed tanks. They shredded infantry formations. But the most staggering statistic belongs to the armaments. Over the course of the war, Hurricane squadrons fired hundreds of millions of .303 caliber rounds. Every single one of those rounds had to be mined, refined, stamped, filled, shipped, and loaded by the men and women of the democratic nations. It was a chain of production that stretched from the copper mines of Arizona to the skies over Europe. The German war machine could not comprehend this scale. They believed that war was a contest of martial spirit and engineering brilliance. The arsenal of democracy proved that war, ultimately, is a problem of mathematics. The side that can throw the most metal into the air at the highest velocity will eventually win. The records of the German Federal Archives contain the letters of soldiers who realized this truth long before their leadership did. The figures cited here come from the German Federal Archives. If you have encountered different numbers in your own research, the source matters. The comments are where this history stays accurate. By 1944, the Hurricane was finally being withdrawn from frontline fighter duties. It had fought against the most advanced aircraft in the world, and it had survived through pure, stubborn utility. The 12-gun Mark IIB variants were heavily modified, stripped of their weapons, and used as target tugs or transport aircraft. The vast arsenals of Browning machine guns were repurposed for other duties. but the legacy of the aircraft remained. It had fundamentally changed the way the Luftwaffe evaluated enemy capability. The German analysts never again dismissed a crude or obsolete weapon. They learned to look past the aerodynamics and examine the industrial force behind the machine. They learned that a slow, heavy airplane carrying 12 machine guns is not an aeronautical failure. It is a flying manifestation of industrial supremacy. The hubris of the German bomber crews in 1941 was built on a lie. They believed their armor was a permanent shield against an inferior enemy. The horror they experienced was the sudden, violent realization that armor only works against a limited volume of fire. When the volume approaches infinity, the armor ceases to matter. The Hawker Hurricane was the perfect instrument for delivering this lesson. It was unglamorous. It was utilitarian. It was a working-class machine built for a working-class war. It did not win the war with elegance. It won the war by taking a staggering amount of punishment and by carrying an impossible amount of weaponry into the sky. When Weber wrote his final reflections after the war, he did not dwell on the tactical mistakes of the German command. He dwelled on the factory floors he had never seen. He recognized that the moment the Allied engineers decided to pack 12 machine guns into a single fighter, the war was already lost. It demonstrated a level of material abundance that Germany could never match. The Heinkel 111 was a masterpiece of German aviation. It was destroyed by a flying warehouse armed with mass-produced American guns. This is the true story of the arsenal of democracy. It is not a story of flawless heroes or magical weapons. It is the story of overwhelming, undeniable mathematical reality. The 13,200 rounds per minute delivered by the Hurricane Mark II-B was not just a rate of fire. It was a statement of intent from the free world. It was the sound of 1,000 factories answering the challenge of totalitarian aggression. And for the men sitting in the bombers, it was the sound of the end of their world. The industrial stories of American democratic achievement are not exhausted by any single account. Each operation, each weapon system, each logistical miracle reveals another dimension of what this country produced when tested at its fullest. The next account is prepared